activists tend to try to reproduce conflicts from other contexts in their own societies in ways that are not productive. And the third may simply be that there's regression to the mean, meaning simply that the more people are using a technique, the more likely it is that that technique becomes worn. But what I can tell you is that in evaluating these cases carefully in my own research, there are still really important lessons that are consistent with previous times about what makes effective resistance movements. And one of them is that all of the movements that we've seen in the past 5 years that have succeeded have done so using the same general principles as those that came before. The first is that they are very large and diverse in their participation base. They're cross-cutting, and they usually try to bridge divides within the society. The second is that they don't rely on a single nonviolent method like protest. They don't just protest every Friday at noon. They use a wide variety of techniques: protests, strikes, boycotts, non-cooperation of many forms, cultural resistance, and they do so in ways that escalate and disrupt, not just using symbolic actions. The third thing they do is that they tend to create loyalty shifts or defections within those pillars of support. As I mentioned, they can be economic elites or business elites, not just security forces, but somehow they have an inside game as well as an outside game. And then finally, the movements that succeed tend to maintain discipline, even when the state becomes more repressive. In particular, they seem to be less prone to chaos when the state starts to use more violent repression. So with that, I'll just reiterate the 3 major points to take away and then open it up for discussion. The first is that nonviolent resistance is surprisingly effective as a method of struggle. The record of success was convincing even to a skeptic like myself, who collected the data and expected to find a different result. The second important finding, which I didn't really delve into here, but I cover extensively in our book, is that this finding holds even in contexts where we would expect nonviolent resistance to be highly ineffective, in very difficult repressive places where the societies were deeply divided across ethnic, religious, or sectarian lines. And third, that the way that a movement fights sharply determines the type of country that we'll get to live in afterward. And this is a really important insight that is consistent with Gandhi's own commitment to linking ends and means. There is actually a strong theoretical and empirical link between the way that one fights and the type of society that emerges. So with that, I will simply recognize a few people that have funded my research before and stop here to ask for your questions or comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you one more time for collecting and digesting all this data. As I said, it's really important for us who are working here on a daily basis in different peace-building activities. But before I open the floor, I will just use the opportunity as a moderator also to ask maybe 2 additional questions. Can you tell me how those data can be useful for the policymakers? You told me that you already have been working with Obama administration. They were very keen to use this data to implement it in their foreign policy tools. But what was also very interesting for me that even Pope Francis invited you to help him to articulate the official position of the Catholic Church towards the nonviolence and revolution. So can you make comments on how we can use that in daily policy lives?
Sure. So with regard to the Obama administration, after the Syrian uprising and civil war outbreak, President Obama formed what he called the Atrocities Prevention Board, which was a White House task force meant to try to develop better tools for anticipating outbreaks of violence toward civilians. So the way that these data have been useful in that effort is by trying to better forecast using these major episodes of contention as an indicator of threat to regimes, and also the data that I've collected on security force defections. Those have actually proved to be the two most important predictors of whether a crisis will result in a mass killing by a state. And in fact, the forecasting tool that Evan Perkowski and I have developed is something like 98% accurate. It's the most accurate forecasting tool in the world for mass atrocities at this time. The second intervention that you mentioned is the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which is an initiative that maybe some people here are familiar with or have been involved in, where there's a group of people led by Pax Christi and others who are developing a series of arguments to present to Pope Francis to sort of nudge him toward developing a new encyclical centering nonviolence in Catholic doctrine. And so what I'm doing as part of that effort is I'm serving as a scientific advisor, where as a committee we're trying to collect research and information that already exists in the world to show that there are realistic, nonviolent alternatives to almost all forms of political violence that are used in the world. Whether that's interstate conflict, where we can look at mediation or negotiation or diplomacy, whether it's armed struggle, we can use this research on nonviolent resistance to demonstrate that there are realistic alternatives, to really demonstrate that most of the just war criteria have an answer in scientific data that is not violent. So that's the effort there, and we're hoping to see some outcome from that.
That's the beauty of this data, how actually they can be useful in daily life and really make the change then in political arena. And one more question, and then promise that I open the floor. I mean, you're coming from states, and you know, Trump, I mean, what to say. I was also very surprised when you told me, you know, but I also want to tell the other story of America, because we are really referring so much to Trump these days, and no one is talking what's going on behind the Trump. So the data you are now collecting is also about tremendous civil resistance that's going on across America. So can you make a short comment on that, and what is the chance of this movement really to overturn the Trump?
Yeah, so one of my favorite things in the past year, really my only favorite thing in the past year, has been collecting data on the nonviolent resistance in the United States right now. And I co-direct a group called the Crowd Counting Consortium. You can Google us. And we're a group of volunteer political scientists that I've helped to co-organize, where we're tracking every single day's resistance and counter-resistance against Trump. So the reason this effort started was because of the Women's March. How many people participated in a sister march? Yeah, see, I counted Zagreb, you guys were on the map. But basically, there were, in the United States, 4.3 million people who turned up on January 21st of 2017, the day after Trump was inaugurated, and engaged in the largest single-day demonstration in the history of the United States, more than 1% of our population, which is, by the way,
less than 3.5,
but way more than we've ever had. Okay, so it demonstrated a latent capacity, that sleeping dragon, so to speak. Many of the Women's March participants were then kind of organized into Indivisible, which is a group that engages both in grassroots mobilization and in electoral politics. And so what we've done is counted each action. This is just showing February to April. But you can see that we have hundreds of events per week that take place in the United States. On average, we're seeing almost 1,000 events per month. We're seeing millions of people demonstrating over and over again over time. And these are in so many different areas, from the airport protests that broke out after the first attempted Muslim ban that I participated in and my wife participated in, to the sanctuary movement, which is protecting undocumented immigrants from being deported, to the protection of our public health care system, to the protection of Black Americans from police brutality and white supremacists. So there is a broad range of mobilization, more than I've ever seen in my lifetime, certainly. And I think that the probability that this will result in meaningful political change in the United States is very high. Whether it results in the removal of President Trump from office is a separate question. My sense right now in the United States is that he will serve a full term, so a full 4 years. If he's reelected, I think the probability of impeachment goes up a lot, and especially if the Republicans lose control of Congress. So most of the strategies in the electoral sense right now are focusing on trying to win back congressional majorities in the 2018 elections, which is what to pay attention to from here. But this is just my plug to watch all the Americans resisting, because it's the most exciting time in my life in that regard, and that's the big good news coming out of the United States right now, is how many people are fighting, and most of them first-timers. They've never been involved in activism before, and so you'll also see them make some mistakes, but at least they're fighting.
Thank you. So please, questions from the audience. Please. There is a mic.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Anna Matan and I'm a fan. I know the argument from your book. But there is since I'm a political theorist and a normative political theorist, I've always had this question of how to connect your lyrical data to some more normative theories of civil disobedience and the moral argument behind civil disobedience. So, do you know, or have you been thinking of doing some kind of connection to this type of research? And especially why I'm asking this is because what you're showing as the importance of big numbers and diversity of participation, I look at that more as a sign of the movement being legitimate and having legitimate goals or being morally right in a sense, which is an assumption, but on the other hand it doesn't have to be true. So which leads me to another question. This is just asking for your comment on it. And the question is, what if some bad guys get a hold of your method?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly. This is one of the, I think, most important critiques and a key concern with the lack of kind of normative scope to the argument. What I would say is that I agree with you largely that the numbers and diversity of participation are generally an indicator of legitimacy, but there is a concern that they're more an indicator of resonance, right, than legitimacy. And we know that at certain times in different societies' histories, really bad ideas can resonate with a lot of people, right? And so many of my colleagues, critical theorists and others, have really pushed us to try to articulate some kind of moral scope behind when it's appropriate to use nonviolent resistance. And I have not really delved too thoroughly into that set of questions myself, although it is something I think about quite a lot. I haven't quite sorted out what I think. But generally, what I can say now is that our hope is that the argument will be taken up by those seeking progressive and progressive radical aims, as opposed to those that are seeking to set the clock back. You know, the people that make the best argument are the ones that are going to find the technique most useful. A great example of what I think is an abuse of civil resistance has happened in Thailand, for example, where the technique has been used to roll back democratic reforms and reimpose basically royal rule or sort of tribunal rule. That can happen, right? You can have anti-liberal aims, for example. But in general, you know, there's kind of a question about what is the alternative, you know? So if we limit the use of nonviolent resistance to only those with aims that we agree with, then are we basically implicitly saying that those with aims we don't agree with should use violence, or you know? So there is a trick, but I'm glad you brought it up. I do think about it a lot, and I don't have a very satisfying answer, but I can point you to people like Stellan Van Hagen, Sean Chabot, and a few others that have published in the Journal of Resistance Studies. They have actually tried to articulate a vision for when civil resistance is appropriate, and also the types of goals that we should be asking for. In their case, they're much more radical than the ones that I've presented here. They're economic reformations and so forth. But in my case, I'm more interested in kind of measurement and figuring out how we can make more discrete claims about this process.
Please, another one. Question? Comments? Quiet audience. Yes, please. I think you were first.
She pointed out.
Hi, my name is Zoran Tomic. Bush was elected before Trump, and yet the resistance is so great now and wasn't so great then, at least in the civil society. Do you think it has anything to do with the example that was set by Bernie Sanders in his campaign, or it's unrelated in your opinion?
That's a good question. I think it's actually less related to Bernie and more related to Occupy and the Arab Awakenings, which really dramatize the power of people power in the United States. And really, honestly, we've had a quite active civil mobilization in the US since 2011, with first Occupy and then Black Lives Matter, and then what's now broadly referred to as the movement for Black Lives. But we've had economic justice action, we've had climate justice action. Much like the rest of the world, the United States is a very contentious place right now. Under Bush, the primary mobilization that took place was actually related to the Iraq War. So there were about 1 million people that tried to resist the Iraq War in the US, and honestly, 9 million people outside the US that tried to do it. And that was obviously did not prevent that, although it may have delayed it a bit. But you're right that it was relatively quiet then, and now we're a much more active civil society. I think part of it just has to do with the zeitgeist in the world, where people, as I showed in the data, are just turning to civil resistance as a method of contention much more often. And it's much more widely known that this is an option for people that want to change their situation.
Another question.
Thank you for the talk. I'm introduced to the book, with your book, and I used some parts of it for my final work in peace studies last year. And there was one question that rose up, but I don't think I saw the answer. So if there is an answer, I apologize, but anyway, maybe it's good to talk about it. So the question is, it's about resistance, being it violent or non-violent. We need to resist the oppression. So the question is, did you notice some pattern or would you recommend some methods how to help people to get conscious of need to resist, being it any way of resisting?
a great question. So how do we convince an apathetic population to become interested in resistance in the first place? That is, yeah.
Sorry, just when you say apathetic, I would say that there are two main ways how we get this to be apathetic. One is that we are so much burdened in trying to secure our existence that we have no energy, time, ability. The other thing is this capitalistic way of giving you things, buying you to not think. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So there is an important, we don't answer that question in our book, so you didn't miss it. Yeah, I know. But I would point you to another scholar of social movements named Doug McAdam, who wrote a book about the civil rights movement in the United States. It's called Political Process and the Development of Black Insurgency. And in his book, he talks about what he calls the process of cognitive liberation. And cognitive liberation is a process that people go through where they first realize that there is active harm and oppression underway. The second thing that they realize is that they feel personally that they have to do something. And then the third process is that once they start to do something, they realize that they can never forget that this oppression is here. So, in other words, the genie is out of the bottle. There's no going back, that they will continue to fight until there's change. And McAdam argues that this process of cognitive liberation occurs when people are ready to mobilize for whatever reason. It's very difficult to predict. Sometimes there's an episode of violence that is so direct and brutal that people become aware in a way they weren't before. Other times it's simply that a movement emerges and has such a message of hope and power that people are attracted to it, and then they become radicalized. And other times there's simply a political opportunity or opening where some kind of entrepreneurial figure, a symbolic figure or a leader of some sort, is able to articulate a vision that's so appealing, and they are able to do it in a way that increases confidence that there is change possible. So McAdam argues that when these things are present, that people are more likely to move from that apathetic place into action, even if they're the ones that are being oppressed, or especially if they're the ones being oppressed. But also people that are kind of on the sidelines, who aren't directly impacted by the oppression, but are just completely inspired to become involved. And they too will not go back to a period where they were apathetic. So that's the best book, I think, on what happens for people when they move from one place to another. And otherwise, it's not something we cover in our book very well.
Do you have more questions? Comments? Yes?
Just one simple question. What do you think, or have you researched, what are the most relevant conditions or preconditions for the struggles to be violent or non-violent? So you said that there were several factors of why a non-violent movement is successful, and in this way I would also like to know, you said that motivation was one, or motivation is one, and another thing was, I think I forgot, it doesn't matter. So, but what makes the movements non-violent or violent? Is it geographical? Is it historical, contextual? How?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was one that I was really concerned about, because of course, if there are conditions that predispose a country to one or the other method of struggle, then the claim that one or the other method of struggle is more effective is not strong, right? So we actually devoted a whole chapter in our book to this question, and I've done a lot of research afterward as well to double check. But it turns out that if you look at the type of country or the type of dictatorship or occupation, if you look at the strength of the country, meaning their military capacity or industrial power, if you look at their economic output, their region of the world, or even their population demographics, none of those conditions predict whether a campaign will be nonviolent or violent. Neither do they predict whether the campaign will succeed or fail. So that was very interesting. As a political scientist, most of what I'm interested in is how state institutions and capacity shape human behavior. This study tells us that human behavior shapes state institutions and capacities. I did not expect to find that. One of the things that I have discovered in research that was published this year with my colleague Jay Ohlfelder is that we are getting a little better at predicting the timing of the outbreak of nonviolent resistance, but it's a surprising finding. The finding is that as a country becomes more repressive, it's more likely to face a nonviolent uprising. And this is actually because of what I just mentioned about the previous question, that the starkness of the oppression becomes more obvious to more people. And so they want to rise up before it gets too bad. That's what's happening in the United States. So it's actually a really important and counterintuitive finding, because most people think that as a society becomes more repressive, people are more likely to use arms. We don't find that. Not today, anyway.
Yes.
Does it include economic?
Sorry. First mic here and then.
Hi, I'm Luca. I'm interested, does this include also economic factors like recession, unemployment? So it has non-linked to, yeah. Okay.
That's correct. Now remember that the data that I'm showing here is maximalist campaigns. So if your question is just about general protest, for example, we don't measure that. But we measure claims to, engage in more maximalist politics. Other scholars have looked at things like economic recessions, unemployment, economic output, general well-being, like infant mortality rates and things. And the studies are mixed about the degree to which economic factors are correlated with protest.
And this with the success of the nonviolent protest.
Yeah, it is uncorrelated with the success. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this interesting lecture, and thank you for giving us all hope by calculating how many of us is necessary to start one successful nonviolent peace movement to change something. I have a question. Do you find any kind of difference on the conceptual level, on the practical level, between the so-called, let's put it this way, reactive nonviolent resistance versus proactive peaceful social movements? So not only those who are oppressed in some kind of war or conflict situation or whatever, in comparison with those who are more engaged with some kind of pro-policy, so to say. And second question, would you rather try to measure the success of some non-violent movement, not only in political terms, but also